Hello, everybody, and welcome to this presentation. It is the 1st of January 2023, and wishing you a very happy and prosperous new year. And I'm delighted to have the company of my long-standing dear friend, Phil Anderson, from both London and Melbourne, who we're going to be talking to about a lot of stuff. And
hi, Andy. How you doing?
Hi. Happy New Year, Phil. Good to have you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks. It's not so long since we caught up last in London, actually. A month or two back.
London, I think it was just 4 or 5 weeks ago. 4 weeks ago, wasn't it? Yeah. Having some nice food there and afternoon teas, putting the world to rights. So good to see you. And I want to welcome everybody from the foundation to this also the market timing report, because what we're going to be talking about, amongst many things, is the 18-year cycle. And Edward Dewey, in his book, The Science Cycles, The Science of Prediction, I'm lucky to have one of the originals here from 1947, talked about the 18-year cycle prolifically. And of course, all you members of the foundation will know all about that. And more specifically, in this chapter on the 18-year cycle, he talks about real estate cycles and also skyscraper booms and busts there as well. So what we've got here is Phil, and Phil is the author, Phil of Property Share Market Economics, is also the author of the highly acclaimed book, The Secret Life of Real Estate and Banking. And I cannot recommend this book enough. It is the most fantastic tome on really on learning how to forecast by learning what's happened in the past, and not just about markets, but about history and so on. So welcome, Phil. Where do we start? Well,
nice to be here.
Real estate. This is your real forte.
Yes. Well, years ago, I don't know why I had a bent on economics, and when I did my economics at both high school and university, the teachers and the academics, they were explaining all this theoretical stuff. And yet you'd walk out onto the streets and it was just the opposite. I remember them talking about the so-called J curve. I mean, I was far more interested in the curves of other things than a J curve. But, the academics, they tell you that you couldn't have unemployment and inflation exist at the same time. You had to have one or the other. It was always a trade-off. And, I did my stuff in the late 1970s and early 80s, and that was a period where you actually had both. You had high unemployment, high inflation levels, and it was just both things, right? And you couldn't the academics couldn't tell you why that was. And so, I just I thought that, I'd go overseas and see what I'd find out myself. And I remember saying to myself, I wasn't coming home until I'd actually worked out, how things actually worked, the economy in particular. And I did that, and I had a bit of an epiphany in India, of all places, as it happens. It just occurred to me that the whole thing about economics is, if you want to understand economics and if you want to do forecasting, you have to understand the land market. And I found that out in India with I won't go into the story here, but it became obvious that land was the missing piece of the equation that economists don't tend to understand. So when I did that, after I came back from overseas. This would have been 1986, 87. I got onto a book. Fortunately, I can tell you, I got onto a book by Fred Harrison, and Harrison had studied the economics, and he said what the economics profession are missing is the land market. Economics today only has two factors of production, and I know, Andy, when you start talking about economics like this, people roll their eyes and they start turning up their nose and thinking, geez, I don't want to do economics. But if you want to forecast the future somewhat accurately, you have to understand that the economics profession has been corrupted, and it's been deliberately corrupted. And Fred Harrison went into that in a wonderful book called The Corruption of Economics. He did that with Mason Gaffney. He also put out Fred Harrison put out a trilogy of books. He put out another book with a marvelous economist in the US, the philosophy of names escape me at the moment. Philosophy for a Fair Society with Professor Michael Hudson. And then he put out another one called Land and Taxation with a professor in the US again called Nick Tiedemann. And they're three books that I highly recommend all Foundation for the Study of Cycles people get, because until you see that the economics profession has been thoroughly corrupted, they have deliberately written the land out of economics. And these books tell you why that's the case. Once you see that, you then it opens up a whole new vista of stuff that you can study. And then, as it happened, Harrison also put out a book about it was just simply called The Power in the Land, but it followed on from some work by a US academic, US planner, really, called Homer Hoyt. And, you know, some of your listeners and viewers are probably familiar with Homer Hoyt. Homer Hoyt did a classic 1930s study. It was a thesis for his doctorate, I believe. And he studied the land and housing market for Chicago. And he found that Chicago, the city of Chicago, right up until 1933 or thereabouts when he released his thesis, he found that the city of Chicago had real estate cycles. Now, he didn't profess to say that these were regular, and indeed in the end he concluded that it was probably the result of a developing city. But he did say that the clear cycle was never, the cycles he showed, 5 of them from Chicago, was never shorter than 17 years and never longer than 21. Now, as it happened, I don't remember why, I went over to the US in the early 1990s. This is pre-internet, mind you. You didn't have all the luxury of Google and stuff searching today. And I came across some work by a chap called Roy Wenslick. And Roy Wenslick was operating out of St. Louis at the same time as Homer Hoyt was in Chicago. And Roy Wenslick, he was probably the first he was an appraiser as well, valuation officer. He was probably the first guy that really put stuff together and actually did some forecasting. And so he ran an economic forecasting service from about 1933, 34, something like that, maybe earlier, right up until 1974, the day he died. And he clearly believed that the US had a real estate cycle. He includes in some of his work the stuff by Dewey, which showed 18 1/3 real estate cycle, so he referenced it. But I suspect that Wenslick was probably first, and then he put that to good use by starting a service that was actually forecasting. Now, Roy Wenslick in 1936 released a book called The Coming Boom in Real Estate. Now, think about that, 1930s, right? The Great Depression, absolutely nobody was interested in buying anything, if indeed they had any money. And here he was in 1936, right at the bottom of the Depression, really. He said that markets would recover. He said that US real estate, it was an absolutely a screaming buy. He said the stock market was a screaming buy, and he said by the early 1950s, the US would be in a a recovery situation. And so it came. Now Wenslick didn't see the Second World War, right? So in the finish, the cycle that he predicted up into 1955, the next low, it really wasn't much of a speculative thing involved. But then, after 1955, he forecast again that markets markets would again continue and recover after the war. And he forecast that by the time the mid-1970s, the US would again be in the grip of raging inflation, raging bull market, and quite high levels of property prices. And he was exactly right. But his book, his book in 1936, The Coming Boom, I mean, it just went nowhere. You can't get a copy; it's very hard to find. So I think once you realise that the economics itself has been corrupted, so the information that you need to know isn't going to be in economics course, and it isn't going to be in university. And might I add, once you work out why the land market isn't taught in the economics faculty at the university, once you work out why that is, you come to realise why you must get a cycle. So it's very important. And then, of course, Wenslick and Harrison. And so I thought, I was doing that early 1990s. I thought to myself, I was working in a family business, and I thought, I don't know whether, Andy, how it is in a family business, but it can get fairly testy at times. You're working with your siblings and your dad and your mum. I just wanted to do my own thing. So, I decided I should write a book myself, because all the stuff I was reading and researching about all these cycles, I started to discover that I actually knew more than the authors and the books I was reading. So, I don't say that to a big note myself, but it became obvious that once you couldn't get the information from the normal books I was reading, you sort of had to put your own out. That's what I went ahead and did. Thank heavens, because it documented the stuff, and the book I produced, which I do think, if I may say so, is I was very happy how it came out, because it sits very nicely in a collector's bookshelf.
Well, yeah, let me come in there. I mean, I have marked this up with so many. This is just the most incredible. I think the title does it a bit of an injustice, because it's far more than this. It's all about the real economic patterns, the stock market patterns, everything, and the war cycles, and also the creation of America and the modern Western economy. I mean, I could not put it down, and I have it is completely marked up. In fact, I think I first said to you, I'd always when I met you, and we go back 20 years plus. If I always aspired to write a book on this stuff. But nothing can surpass what you've done, so I'm not even going to try. I mean, I've written stuff on books and other stuff.
Yes, but you can add some nice, Andy. You'll be able to add some nice patterns, and the some of the more shall we say esoteric GAN-minded stuff. You'll be able to add quite a bit of that stuff to it. I didn't put all of the esoteric things in that I perhaps could have, but once you realise that the economics, the science of economics, has been thoroughly corrupted. And then once you start to work out, you have a look at a few historical authors. And I mean, Andy, as you know, up until the Second World War, the study of economics was largely considered a study of cycles. I mean, everybody knew and had a reasonable idea that farm prices went up and down, the weather went well and went badly. You had heat and cold, and you had natural cycles you had to prepare for. The issuance of money had a cycle. Economics was basically trying to study those sorts of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was Keynesian based, really, wasn't it? It was really kind of Keynesian economics. There was less of the, the stuff that's coming like.
Well, Keynes in itself, when Keynes came out, I mean, the reason we had Keynes, and the reason was he accepted, because he said that if the government spent money when nobody else did, and then when everybody else was spending money, the government could start to rake it in a bit, he said you'd eliminate the business cycle. I mean, that's why it came in. So it's so hard today for people to see some of that, but it was blindingly obvious at the time that back in the 1930s something was required to be done to eliminate the dreadful ups and downs that they've been having. Now, unfortunately, with Keynes, he was, in one sense, he was right, but of course, governments and politicians discovered that if you can pump money into the economy all the time, so regardless of whether the economy is going well or bad, politicians can get re-elected. So that's what they've been doing now, and now we've ratcheted up, and the debts have got higher and higher, and every time there's even a blip in the stock market, politicians rush to the bankers to say, well, you've got to print some money, you've got to get us out of this dip. People are not going to like it. We can't have economics, we can't have the system collapsing. And despite all of that, the real estate cycle has still been in operation. So it's testament to what Dewey put down in his works, and it's testament to what Homer Hoyt and Roy Wenslick, and indeed probably the best of the lot, Fred Harrison, had to say about all these things and about the whole cycle. So people who come to me and say the cycles don't exist and it's a figment of people's imagination, they get short shrift from me, because it's completely wrong. It's just that we've forgotten a few things today, I think.
So Phil, can you drill down into the real estate cycle as you see it, and perhaps talk us through it and identify where we are in it? Because there's a lot of stuff in the papers right now, and the papers, showing my age there, on the internet and wherever you get your news media from these days, on your phone, suggesting that there's going to be a large drop in house prices. What do you say?
But Andy, speaking of that, the internet, everything that's on it, it isn't making us any smarter. Honest, it isn't. People who are trying to get their information from the internet and try and learn more stuff, it's just not going to happen. You have to go back to some of those old books. Yeah, you can certainly use the net to find them and buy a copy perhaps, but the sort of stuff we're discussing and the reasons why it was especially the corruption of economics, it was deliberately written out of economics. And Harrison and Mason Gaffney, they show you why, they give you the dates and what happens. This was all done after the Second World War in the 1950s, especially. You're going to miss it. People who just want to get their stuff from the net, they're going to miss it. They have to come to understand the reasons behind those things. When you drill down a little bit, Harrison himself, in Power in the Land, demonstrated that the land price bottomed in 1955 in the United States. And it is the United States that you have to follow. Everything starts with the US. The cycle begins and ends in the US, and everything else follows, although we've had the development of China coming through. I might speak a bit about that in a minute.
Can I ask you why its genesis in America rather than in Europe, which arguably has had house and land speculation far longer?
Well, that's a good question. The genesis was in the United Kingdom. The genesis started in 1600, and Fred Harrison shows you that in a book called Boom Bust, which came out in 2005. That was the genesis, and before America really got going, prior to 1776 or so, prior to 1792, it was the UK that was doing stuff because they were the eminent power. But once the US developed, it was an interesting scenario. Throughout the 1800s, America would have its boom and bust with a difference of 9 years to the UK. And that's a very interesting scenario because Dewey found a lot of 9-year cycles in immigration into and out of the US and things. And that was the real estate cycle pushing things. So when the UK in the 1800s had their main real estate land price-led downturn, that actually came out to be the mid-cycle slowdown in the US. And it was after the Second World War, really, after 1932, that things synchronized. And so now we've got a real world cycle. And because even though segments of the population in the United Kingdom still think Britannia rules the waves, they don't any longer. And they're isolating.
Rise and fall of civilizations and empires, isn't it?
Yes. So it's all happening in the US now. And then you could say as well, the reason why the world didn't have such a severe downturn after 2008, although it initially looked like it might, is because we've had the rise of China. So after 2008, 2009, it's clear that all the heads of state and the bankers got together. I think they desperately sought the actions of the Chinese to actually pump the economies, which they did. The Chinese started spending in earnest, did a lot of infrastructure stuff that kept up commodity prices. and allowed the West to get out of its downturn. This is not going to happen next time. We've got a doozy of a real estate. We've got a doozy of a land price led recession coming pretty much mid-decade. If people want the exact timing, they can simply look me up at Property Share Market Economics and just get on my free list. Won't cost them anything. Just sign up to the blog, and you can get information from there. And I go into all these cycles and I start dating all these things more. But you might, I'm sure people are probably asking, yeah, but why would you need to know so much about these real estate cycles? Well, I can give you two very specific answers to that. The first up, it's a rough 14 years up, 4 down. So if you can work out when the low is.
So 14 years up, 4 down. That's critical, isn't it? That's absolutely.
Yeah, that's it. That's the key. And it's
been. Yeah.
No, it's not a sine wave. And that's been actually since 1955. It's been almost month perfect. It's staggering, really. So that gives you a chance to not panic and worry about what might have been happening 2020, 21, and now last year, because although we've had an absolutely massive pump priming in 2020, 21, and then the Fed takes away the punch bowl 2022, it isn't time yet for the United States real estate prices to actually come down. Sure, certainly the rate of change will slow down, and it has. But at this particular time when you've got interest rates rising, if you know what the real estate cycle is all about, you'll know that with interest rates rising, bank profits are going to skyrocket. And because the bank profits will be skyrocketing, the banks will have a chance, because they will get a few loans from people that are now a little bit underwater if they borrowed it, and house prices, the rate of change is coming down a little bit. But if any of their borrowers get into trouble, because the banks are actually making a prodigious margin at the moment on lending at 6% and paying only a measly, 1.5 or whatever if they're paying it, their margins rise, right? So banks at this particular time in the cycle can afford to be generous. You'd also know, if you knew your cycle well enough, and if you know why economics has been corrupted, you'll know that the events that happened in 2022 had to happen for the real estate cycle to continue and indeed complete as it should, because once you've studied the cycle, and this is all detailed in my book, so the book is a great place for people to start. You'll know that the cycle will complete with the actions over the next few years, which I detail those sorts of actions that are coming up in all the past cycles. So eventually, once the stock market kicks off, probably after March this year, as profits increase, as bank margins increase, bank share prices go up, they will be able to start lending in earnest. Now, again, if you know your economics and your cycle, banks don't lend money. They create credit. It's a big fallacy that the banks take in your money and then lend it out to someone else. They actually create credit. Over the next couple of years, banks will be able, especially in the US, will be able to create prodigious credit. And that's what they'll do. And the cycle will really kick off for the second half. Now, why would you want to know the cycle and how good is it for you to know? Well, anybody who does end up joining my free list and goes on to actually see some of my stuff, they will see that we've got statistics that show right back to the 1960s, in the second half of every real estate cycle, technology stocks do poorly relative to the banking, insurance, real estate sectors. Now, if you think about it, that tends to make sense, because in the second half of the cycle, interest rates are usually rising. Then the earnings of tech stocks, or indeed the non-earnings of tech stocks, they have to be future discounted at a higher rate of interest, which means the forward profits are not worth as much. So the whole investment cycle changes in the second half of the cycle. And I clearly stated this when we were expecting the top of the first half of the real estate cycle, which President Trump duly let us know was happening because he told everybody he created the best economy in the world, that was due at the top at the very start of 2020 in January. It was just taking it. And I'm not telling you anything new there, Andy. It's just basic 20, 60-year cycles. Once that turn took place, everybody I was dealing with and was telling, we were out of tech stocks. And we were more in cash and just waiting for the whole thing to turn. And so now, and as you'll be able to see if you can read some charts properly, some of the banking stocks are starting to make a few breaks. Slowly, it's not happening quickly, but slowly. But that's the sort of thing that you can notice. Now, I'm not saying that tech stocks aren't going to go up. They will continue to do so. But if you know your real estate cycle, the second half of the cycle indicates that the speculative side of the industry tends to do better in the second half because banks are creating a lot of credit, land prices continue to go up, people start speculating, and indeed, in the second half, one of the things you can know when you're in the second half of the cycle is that certainly since the last couple of cycles since the Second World War, tech stocks start to focus on their if you like, their own real estate, which is their database, and they start working out how they can start lending to their own database, or indeed they may start buying banks. And that kicks you into the second half of the cycle. And because the tech stocks will want to increase their earnings, they'll see that the banks are doing so well, they'll start to look at banking themselves or in some way doing this sort of stuff. And then when that happens, the second part of the real estate cycle is really, we're off and running, off to the races, and then everybody's speculating. And that leads into the decade here.
So what you're really saying is that the downturn we've seen in the tech stocks at this moment in time is short-lived then? Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, it's going to be longer lived than the other part of the market, being commodities, real estate, insurance, those sectors. And indeed, as you can see, the Dow through 2022 actually recovered most of its down move. The Nasdaq didn't. So that's not something that was any surprise to me and my subscribers. We were watching for that sort of stuff. It was this is what the real estate cycle is all about. And if you get to read my book, I show you that the whole cycle is based on what we call, or what I call, the capitalization of earnings. And so when the earnings of land are permitted to capitalize into a price, and this price is traded and credit created upon that price by banks, you must get a cycle. It must, absolutely must. This is the law, okay? So anybody that wants to argue with me, anybody at all that wants to say, oh, we can't get a real estate cycle, they don't exist anymore, and other like that, they're just plain wrong, because it just goes against science. There's nothing esoteric about this. It's just the economics and the science of the way earnings capitalize into a price. Now, once you see that, the next question you have to ask yourself is, why does it come out so regularly at 18 and a half years? It's just absolutely staggering. And so that's the sort of question you can start to get into once you realise what the cycle is all about. And then, that must have been what Edward Dewey asked himself about all these cycles. He said, why? He saw them, he measured them, and he would have known that some of them were blinding. It was just plain science, because you get earnings. Why are they so regular? And then he would have gone into, start delving into, also might have led him down all sorts of rabbit holes and tracks and everything else and blind alleys. But you do eventually come to a sort of understanding of the planetary science and esoterics and stuff, and then you can start. Then it becomes really interesting about what you can do. And I know Dewey must have gone down that track, and a few people have, and it's been exceedingly rewarding for me, because it gives me now, because I can see the time base of the cycle at 18 and a half years, it gives you a fantastic backbone when I stand up again in a crowd or do a presentation against and talking to people that are basically antithetical to anything I might have to say. It gives me great ability to have the courage to say, yep, I've studied this. once you know science, the economics has been corrupted. Once you know the cycle and the capitalisation of the land rent into a price, we have to get the cycle. It's an absolute must. And so therefore, anybody sitting in the audience that won't agree with me, they are going to be wrong. It's as simple as that.
So the 18 and a half year cycle, 18 years, 6 months, really is a generational cycle, isn't it?
Yes, you could say that too. There's probably something in that. As a generational type thing, what you can say is that by the time the next cycle comes around, by the time we get, as we are where we are at the moment, there's probably now nobody under about 42 that has any knowledge of the prior cycle.
Yeah.
And this is why, a lot of all the young people getting into crypto saying, oh, this time it's different. Crypto's new, doesn't apply to all the stuff that was happening. I had a good, it just wasn't going to be the case because crypto itself, that's the capitalization of earnings. And when there aren't any earnings, it goes back to zero. I mean, it's just science, really. It's not hard.
So with this, let's just drill down. So if I'm thinking about British real estate cycles, we had a bit of a collapse around about 1989, 1990. And if we add the 18 and a half years to that, that takes us to 2008, 2009, the global financial crisis. And of course, the CDOs, the CDSs, the very unsupportable mortgages. So if we move on 18 years, are we looking at 2027 then really?
After mid decade from here. And if anybody watching or listening, if you want to give yourself proof that this can be forecast, just buy two books. The two books are both by Fred Harrison. His first book in 1983, The Power in the Land, that forecast your reference to the 1989, 1990 top in the UK. Fred forecast that 7 years in advance in that book, and he got it right to the year. Fred then put out another book, one in 1997, one in 2005. The one in 2005 was called Boom Bust, and there in Fred's book, I think it's page 35, page 37, somewhere around there. He said then that in 2005, he said the UK economy would peak in the final quarter of 2007, and he was spot on. Not just to the year, to the quarter this time, right? That's how good you can get things. Now think about that. If you can follow markets like that, and you get an understanding of what causes it, which Fred has, think about if you can really practice that and get on it. Think about what that's worth to you, even if you do nothing but as you get into the last year or two of the real estate cycle, stop buying and don't go into debt. Yes.
So where is it? So if we're talking about 2007 as a low, and you say it's 4 years down, do we come back?
No. Well, 2007 was the top.
Sorry, 2027. Sorry, I meant 2027. Yeah. For where we are now.
Roughly. The thing is though, Andy, you can say those things, and it's all very well to know the date. You've actually got to know what to do with that information. It's all very well, because I can tell you, as you go into tops like that, all your emotions will be telling you to do the opposite than what you've really got to do. We saw that. If ever you want a classic example of those things, you just have a look at how Kim Kardashian was paid to give crypto ads, and then was it what's his name? Damon. What's the actor's name?
Matt Damon.
Matt Damon gave a thing at the Super Bowl on crypto and telling everybody to get into it. Right? That's what measures the extreme tops. But of course, unless you know your history, unless you've actually seen a bit of stuff, you'll never have the backbone to actually do the opposite of what you should be doing. And so this is why you've got to read your history. You've got to read good books. You've got to read my book, Harrison's book, and certainly your books too, Andy. You've got to the stuff on all the cycle stuff. It just gives you the edge. But above all else, I would encourage listeners and viewers. I would encourage them to get a book called The Corruption of Economics, again by Fred Harrison and Mason Gaffney, and actually see why they actually don't understand what's going on. You have been deliberately excluded from what the elite, the owners of government, know. They don't want you to know. They don't want you to know about how important the ownership of land is, because they want it for themselves. And so you'll never get anywhere unless you understand this corruption. It's just so important.
So, okay. I have to agree fully with you. I've read those books. So, and all these things are all about making your own mind up and doing your own research and seeing it for yourself. And
yes, and also it's important, Andy, too, as I'm sure you know, if people are going to keep reading the opinions of others on the net and all on the apps and everything else you can read about all the stuff, see, they don't have the scientific background that an education in cycles will give them, and so they'll be just all you'll hear is all you'll get is an echo chamber of what the common man is saying, and it's just going to mislead you. It's just so important to start reading some independent thinking and then test it for yourself. All the stuff that I put in my book, it's all public. I give all the links. I show them where I got the information, which books I read. I show them how I learnt it. There's no secret in it. And once you go through that, I give all the examples, 11 cycles back in the US. I give all examples of what happened when, what to look for. And heavens above, if you ever wanted to see a repeat so far, my book I signed off in 2009. I mean, it's just been an exact repeat of just all the stuff that I discuss in my book. And so, I give a clock in my book, which is based on the work of Hoyt, Wenslick and Harrison. I tell them how to read the clock. That's on page 360 of the book. And it just, Andy, it goes like clockwork, the whole cycle thing, as you know, it just goes like clockwork. Now, I'm not saying this is easy, but once you realize that the economy has a structure, and that structure has been deliberately written out of the economics textbooks so that you don't know it. But once you realize that structure, it doesn't become very hard to make a reasonable forecast about what will happen next in the real estate cycle. Yes. And, people, it's a fair question they want to ask. All right, Phil, well, what will happen next? Well, what's going to happen next is prodigious amounts of infrastructure. Banks will again make higher profits now going ahead as interest rates have come up. They will start creating more credit, and that will lead to a major land boom. Also, as Dewey noted with his skyscraper stuff, as we go into the second half of the cycle, all of the dictators, all of the guys that want to have their big dicks, everything else that they want to do, they are going to build the world's tallest builders, biggest, largest, whatever else it is, because they're driven by ego. And so this is what we'll get. And indeed, you just have a look at the Saudi market, right? They're building this 75-mile wall, some unbelievable thing. They're now going to build a building that's 2 miles high. I mean, this is just, and it's ludicrous. It's ludicrous behaviour in a rent enclosure economy that's gone utterly mad. Okay, but it will bring in the top of the real estate cycle, because the past 11 cycles all have done exactly the same thing, and we're seeing exactly the same thing now. The taller the building goes, it simply tells you that the amount of credit that's available. Right? I mean, it's just astoundingly simple. Once you start to see it, it's not hard to work out.
Well, I think I just putting that into perspective. I mean, we see things like the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building opening in the early 1930s, having been commissioned during the boom of the 1920s. Then we see the 29 crash. And from what I remember, the Chrysler Building was opened in 33. I think the Empire State just a little bit before that. So
they opened empty.
So, and then we saw things like the Petronas Towers, didn't we, and so on in more recent booms.
The world's tallest, wherever it's built, usually that geographical location will have the worst downturn normally.
And in fact, this is what we saw in the Middle East with Dubai, coming up to the global financial crisis. I was in Dubai pretty much every month, and the rate of change was unbelievable.
Yes, and then it all stopped. It hit a wall.
It all went broke.
Nobody knew what was going on, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
So we've spoken about these booms and busts across different nations. Let's look more specifically at, we talked about the timing of the global financial crisis. Can you fill us in on these sort of details of timing now, and whether this downturn that everybody's talking about in the house prices is a major top.
Well, here's where again, if you study mainstream economics, you're going to get lost. So 14 years up, 4 down. So it was pretty clear. The top 2007, 4 down, which is what we got. Took us to about 2011, 2012. So just add 14 years up, gives you 2026 as an important year to watch. Now, all right, we've had 2022 and all the shenanigans that were happening. As I mentioned earlier, I happen to think that we needed to have a year like what we got. Interest rates had to go back up so that things could normalise. The abnormal year was not 2022. The abnormal year was late 2020 into 2021, when authorities panicked and issued way too much money, printed way too much money and issued way too much credit. That was the abnormality. 2022 was not abnormal. Now, let me take you even further about that and demonstrate too that if you study mainstream economics, you're going to get lost because it doesn't have the land equation in it. As we went through 2022 and interest rates went up, what some said it was unprecedented. That's quite wrong. Now, if since 1955, the Fed in the United States, and I can only deal with the United States because that's a cycle you have to watch. The cycle's based in the United States. Now, US leads and everyone else follows mainly. Since 1955, the Fed has lifted interest rates 11 times. 10 of those times, house prices went up. There wasn't one time, and the other time of those house prices just went sideways. There hasn't been one time when the Fed has lifted interest rates and house prices came down. Never. And indeed, if, this is an interesting thing here that you don't pick up unless you know history, and you'll never pick this up from the internet. Prior to the 1920s, when interest rates were going up in the economy, every single mainstream economist back then, and indeed all market watchers, considered that a bullish development. Interest rates go up because the economy is improving. That's why interest rates are lifted. And so house prices really have only ever declined when interest rates are going down. That's because after the economy tips over, and you'll see this after 2026, after the economy tips over, which always catches the mainstream always by surprise, and my 2 golden rules of investing, number 1, the Fed is always behind the curve, and number 2, governments everywhere in every action they take will make things worse. This is what will happen after 2026. The Fed will be behind the curve because they'll be saying this year that they've had a soft landing, that US didn't have a recession, so they got things under control. That'll relieve everybody and say, well, the Fed can handle things after all, but land prices didn't decline. And indeed, when interest rates go up, land prices usually go up. Interest rates went up in the late 1970s. House prices went up 111%. Interest rates went up in the late 1980s from 86, 7, 8 or something or another. Now, the real estate market tanked a bit there. Sorry, the stock market tanked in 87. The land prices kept going up, right? And interest rates went up. They went up big time. Yes? House prices doubled. US house prices we're talking. You can check that record. You can go back and have a look. Yes? So every single economist came out and said house prices are going to collapse in 2022 because interest rates were going up. It's just plain wrong. So I don't know how you tell people. I put that out. I had a bit of a few sessions with people and they all started laughing, right? They said, well, what does this guy know, right? I've trained as an economist, but an accountant by trade, really. What does he know? And of course, I was the only person that ever said it. Me and my business partner, Akil, we're the only persons that said it. And so you're a lone voice like that. You just don't get believed. And of course, I'm
smiling because both you and Akil were over at our previous house, and as you know, my wife's been has previously been very involved in real estate, and we were umming and ahhing using other cycles as to whether this was a bad time to move or a good time. And you explained it. We went ahead and actually, I think we nailed that particular low, which we weren't expecting on the real estate cycle, because we've seen almost that. Well, we have seen 100% increase in the value of this place you've been to. Yeah,
indeed, that's right. Well, that's what the real estate cycle can be worth to you, because if you understand the cycle and read my book, you can see that the economy does actually have a structure, and it is based on land, basically the enclosure of the economic rent of land. And once you get that, there has to be a cycle. And I think I said before, once you see that, the next question then becomes, why is it so regular? And then when you start to see that, you can actually start to use it for some very profitable information, as you know, Andy, because you've done similar.
Well, great. So I'm just putting this together. So actually, we've discussed this privately, but I think it's worth mentioning here. The 14 years up takes us to 2026. So there's more mileage to the upside. Then 4 years down takes us to 2030, which, of course, is pretty interesting for me because I like to use the 100-year cycle as well. So that's going to take us on from the 100 years on from the 29 crash and downturn then. So we can expect something a little stronger there, possibly.
Yes, it's also, Andy, it's also important to differentiate. We're talking real estate, all right? It doesn't mean the stock market goes 4 years down. You know, the stock market will do its own
absolutely,
thing. Because there's plenty of stocks that actually benefit in a downturn, right? So it can be topsy-turvy. You know, the main indexes will also they will decline at some point later in the decade. Because when land price does turn down, it's land price you've got to watch. When that does turn down, that hurts banks. And if enough borrowers end up with negative equity, in other words, the loans larger value than the outstanding land price of the house, banks can no longer afford to be generous when that happens, and they will start calling in loans. So you will not, after 2026, you will not start seeing emails from a bank saying, how can we help? This isn't going to happen. The banks are going to say, right, you owe us money. If you owe us enough, we want that money back. Thank you very much. So it's just not going to be a time to be heavily in debt. The banks will take your mortgage. They'll take your house if they can. And that's the repeat of 2008, 2009. It's a repeat of 1990, 91. It's a repeat of early 1970s. You know, it's a repeat of the 1930s. 1913, 1914, 1896. How far back do you want to go?
Wow, absolute clockwork, literally.
Yes. And the other thing, Andy, I might mention, I'll do this as a bit of a special for people listening, but I don't mention this too often. But as you know, you know the importance of 20 and 60-year cycles.
Yeah.
You know, people might say this time that China will bail everybody out like they did 2009, 10, 11, 12. But listeners and viewers, you might want to go back and have a look what happened to China between 1966 and 1976, because they've got their 60-year cycle coming up. 60 years very important in China. It's based on their zodiac and everything else they do. 5 times 12. That's a big number, and there's big troubles coming, I think, after 2027.
Yeah, and the US Civil War cycles kick in. Actually, they come in quite soon as well. So I think there's going to be a lot of interesting stuff going on. Yes. So we just clarified.
A long way to go before then. Pretty bullish before then.
Okay, bullish up till then. And then you mentioned earlier on in this presentation that you're looking for the US equity markets to move up from around about March 2023. Can you share any more thoughts about what you think for the year ahead on the stock market?
Oh, yes. Again, you can do this for yourself too, and I know as you do. 20 years ago, 2003. Decent lows around March. You look at 1963 again. So I'm looking for that to repeat. I think should be a good low. I don't think it'll be too much drama. It'll just be a time when after that things could start to kick off quite well. Right throughout the 1960s, we're pretty much a time of turmoil in the US. I expect that to repeat quite a bit, but overall things will be bullish. You know, the whole 100 years thing. The 1920s were very bullish in the United States. It wasn't hard to see why. It was a whole heap of new technology. I'm expecting that to come through. You know, it'll be interesting if we just take the phenomenon of cars. You know, right through the say the 1910s and 20s. There are a lot of God-fearing, heavy churchgoers that were absolutely against cars because they were considered sex on wheels. You'll see similar repeats with all the cars are changing. We are going electric, of course, but a car is no longer going to be a car. It's going to be a communications device, and this is going to throw up enormous difficulties everywhere because basically it makes it easily hackable. It means that you'll be able to, if you can do certain things, if you're pretty good at a hack, you'll be able to use the car as a spying device. There's just some incredible stuff that's going to be happening. All the tech that comes through, right? So it's going to be pretty bullish, but we're going to be faced with some major dilemmas and stuff that could be happening. So, and it's going to affect. It's going to be worldwide, and that whole 60-year thing was. It's going to be interesting to look at. So if you want to get a bit of history, do look at what happened in 1963 and 2003. And it was they were bullish years overall, despite all the turmoil that was happening. And as you know, it is a pretty good saying that markets climb wall of worries, and there's going to be a lot of worries over the next couple of years. But bullish overall, I think. It'll be absolutely really wonderful time, exciting to see some of this stuff. It's going to be tremendous. My son's 21 now. He'll be 21 years, 21. I'd love to be that age again. It's just absolutely astounding what kids can do now. It's absolutely incredible. God, in my day, if I wanted stuff, I had to go into the bloody library or get a book shipped over to me from the US to do my research. Who'd want to go back to that?
Well, Phil, this has been an absolutely terrific presentation. Just summing it up, what you're really saying is that for the stock market, for the US stock market for the year ahead, the 2020, the 60-year and 20-year patterns both suggest lows round about March and move up. Real estate cycle, 14 years up, 4 years down, heading into a top round about 2026 and then down into round about 2030.
Something like that.
What we'll do is we'll put some images in.
The market will tell you, right, Andy? The market will tell you. You don't need to know all the figures. Just if you study the prior cycles, when things happen over the next couple of years, you'll be able to say, yep, I know what that means. Yep, I know what's coming next. Not hard.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Phillip Anderson of Property Share Market Economics. Phil, it's been an absolute pleasure to interview you on behalf of the foundation and all our other followers. So thank you so much. Wishing you a very happy and prosperous 2023.
Yeah. Thanks, Andy. It's always good to chat. I always enjoy chat with you.
Thank you.